Thank you, Whittaker. Good morning. Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Columbus this Sunday, October 11th, 2020. We welcome you whether you be Jewish, Christian, atheist, Buddhist, or whatever, brown, black, or white. We are an open-minded spiritual community working to help people lead lives of justice, learning, hope, and love. We gather in worship to find meaning for our lives as we go forward in courage and resiliency. So breathe deeply, and for this time that we are together, let go of all the expectations you laid on yourself or others laid on you, and just be here in this moment, now. We begin by lighting the chalice, our symbol of reason, tolerance, and freedom, mixed with respect, compassion, and love. The chalice reminds us that by joining together, we find our strength, we find our wisdom, we find our way forward. As service leader, I am tasked with informing our members of what is happening this week. So these are the announcements. The discussion group meets every Wednesday evening at 7 o'clock via Zoom. An email is sent to every fellowship member and friend each week with a link inviting all to join us. As we adapt to the changes around us, seeing each other's face and hearing the attached voice sustains us in fellowship. On Friday, the lunch group meets. Again, it is more of a social get-together. Again, check your email for the invitation. If you have a question about Zoom or anything else about the discussion group or the lunch group, send an email to the fellowship at uufcga@gmail.com. This coming Sunday, October 18th, we will introduce a new format for our online service, and it is a big change. We will broadcast the service live by Zoom at 11 o'clock a.m. That way we can all attend the service together, and we'll also have an opportunity to participate in joys and concerns and in questions and answers following the service. Rick Spradlin will be our service leader and speaker. Members and friends will get an email with login information, or you can find the details on how to log in to on our website. It's the same Zoom technology we've been using for our Wednesday night discussion group and Friday lunches. If you can't attend by Zoom, we'll post a recording of the service later on our YouTube channel. Please remember, this is a test of our technology, so be prepared for a glitch or two. It is part of our plan to return live in-person services when it's safe enough to do that. And last weekend, we took part in a drive-through birthday party. Dick McMichael's 90th birthday was celebrated as we drove through the church parking lot and waved at him sitting on his throne at the church entrance. Joining him was his companion Julie and his family. You saw some of the joyful pictures at the beginning of this service. And this announcement: get prepared to vote. Early voting by absentee ballot is already underway. Both my husband and I have voted, and I know many of you have as well. If you have not requested your mail-in ballot or absentee ballot, they're the same thing, do so today online. The deadline for voting by absentee ballot is fast approaching. Early in-person voting in Georgia begins tomorrow, October 12th. Did you know that? And ends October 30th. but the lines tend to get long as you near the end of that time. Georgia law also requires early voting to be held during one Saturday. So on Saturday, October 24th, you can vote in person. Each county has different hours, locations, and dates for that purpose. So consult the Secretary of State, Georgia office before heading out to vote. It won't be at your normal polling place necessarily, but we must vote. Go to UUA on their website and click on UU the Vote to learn how you can do even more to enable voters, or contact Bill Harlan, who's writing letters and would welcome your help. We must, as Unitarian Universalists, commit to our covenants. Not just hope for a better future beyond our reach, but act to make our mark for a country that once again displays compassion, love for each other, and truth. We must come together collectively so that we can heal our hurting country and world. These covenants are summed up in our 7 principles. The core values that Unitarian Universalists hold as moral guides. And they are, number 1, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Number 2, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. Number 3, acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations. Number 4, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. Number 5, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. There it is. Number 6, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. And 7, respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. This morning, I take the light from the chalice flame that holds us in the circle of love and bring to light the joys and concerns that personally touch our fellowship members. First, I will once again light a candle for those among us who are educators, school children, and beleaguered parents, braving this new world of education. And one for our elderly members and friends who are living in pain or the limiting choices of a fixed income. For those of us who are I would like one for those of us who are involved in the business of bringing joy through entertainment to you. The cruel uncertainty of the pandemic has brought our lives, has brought to our lives and weighed heavily on the arts community. And last, I light a candle for all of you with heavy hearts going through hardship and pain that I haven't touched on this morning. There is a love holding us. By the light of our chalice, let us rest in this love. So here we are together in this crazy lifetime. Let us be lifted up with the words of our celebration of life toast. If you don't have a cup in your hand right now, it may be time for a little acting. If you have one, lift your cups. We celebrate life. We celebrate life with its beauty and its pain. We lift these cups in tribute to the achievements of human minds and hands, and insensitivity to the frustrations of misfortune and heartache, not fixing blame or credit for the outcome of chance, sensing the risk, savoring the joy, sharing it all, knowing of the certainty of death and remembering the value of each moment, we drink this toast in celebration to this time, to the future, to each other, to the throbbing of the earth and sea and sky with life. Say this with me. We drink this toast in celebration of life. Does this look familiar? Even though we're not passing the basket in person, we ask that you help fill our basket from home. Your gift is critical to the mission and vitality of the UU Fellowship. Please consider doing it now. You can mail checks payable to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Columbus at Post Office Box 698, Fortson, Georgia, 31808. Remember, we don't receive mail at our street address. Or you can donate online through PayPal. There's more information on making a donation at our website at uucolumbusga.org. Sign up to PayPal. It'll be easier going forward. I promise. If you have questions, talk to Ron Ussery, who continues to do his work as our treasurer. You can also make a lasting legacy using your will to make a bequest to the fellowship. While you get caught up, Whittaker will play. I mentioned earlier a drive-through celebration, a birthday celebration that happened last weekend. Today, we are honored to have this same man, Dick McMichael, who is thriving in his 90s, come to us this morning to read the words of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Now, following Dick's reading on Emerson, Ron Ussery will talk about this pillar of Unitarian Universalism. I'm talking about Emerson, not Dick. Ron is a longtime member of our fellowship. His resume includes stints as an editor, public relations representative, personnel manager, retirement plan manager, bank vice president, teacher, AV guru, and an avid bicyclist. He is treasurer of our fellowship and an expert in duct tape and used parts in our church. So first, let's hear Dick as Emerson's voice, and then Ron with his take on Emerson's philosophy.
Considered extremely radical at the time, Ralph Waldo Emerson's speech challenged mainstream Christianity and urged listeners to trust their own experiences rather than the status quo doctrine of the church. This is the address that he gave to the graduating class in 1838 at Harvard University. And he said, "Jesus Christ belonged to the true race of prophets. He saw with open eye the mystery of the soul. Drawn by its severe harmony, ravished with its beauty, he lived in it and had his being there. Alone in all history, he estimated the greatness of man. One man was true to what is in you and me. He saw that God incarnates himself in man, and evermore goes forth anew to take possession of his world. He said, in this jubilee of sublime emotion, I am divine. Through me, God acts. Through me, speaks. Would you see God? See me. Or see thee, when thou also thinkest as I now think. But what a distortion did his doctrine and memory suffer in the same, in the next, and in the following ages. There is no doctrine of the reason which will bear to be taught by the understanding. The understanding caught this high cant from the poet's lips and said in the next age, this was Jehovah come down out of heaven. I will kill you if you say he was a man. The idioms of his language and the figures of his rhetoric have usurped the place of his truth, and churches are not built on his principles, but on his tropes. Christianity became a mythos, as the poetic teaching of Greece and of Egypt before. He spoke of miracles, for he felt that man's life was a miracle, and all that man doth, and he knew that this daily miracle shines as the character ascends. But the word miracle, as pronounced by Christian churches, gives a false impression. It is monster. It is not one with the blowing clover and the falling rain. Having seen that the law in us is commanding, he, Jesus, would not suffer to be commanded. Boldly, with hand and heart and life, he declared it was God. Thus is he, as I think, the only soul in history who has appreciated the worth of man. In this point of view, we become sensible of the first defect of historical Christianity. Historical Christianity has fallen into the error that corrupts all attempts to communicate religion. As it appears to us, and as it has appeared for ages, it is not the doctrine of the soul, but an exaggeration of the personal, the positive, the ritual. It dwells with noxious exaggeration upon the person of Jesus. The soul knows no persons. It invites every man to expand to the full circle of the universe, and will have no preferences but those of spontaneous love. One would rather be a pagan, suggled in a creed outworn, than to be defrauded of his manly right in coming into nature and finding not names and places, not land and professions, but even virtue and truth foreclosed and monopolized. You shall not be a man even. You shall not own the world. You shall not dare and live after the infinite law that is in you, and in company with the infinite beauty which heaven and earth reflect to you in all lovely forms. But you must subordinate your nature to Christ's nature. You must accept our interpretations and take his portrait as the vulgar drew it. That is always best which gives me to myself. The sublime is excited in me by the great social doctrine, obey thyself. That which shows God in me fortifies me. That which shows God out of me makes me a wart and a wen. There is no longer a necessary reason for my being. Already the long shadows of untimely oblivion creep over me, and I shall decease forever. So the idea is to be you, to be yourself, because God is in you. The words of Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Wow, Dick. I really feel like you took us back to 1838. That really, to me, rang of what Waldo would have sounded like. You know, Ralph Waldo Emerson actually, when he gave that speech, he was 35 years old. 35 years old, Dick is 90. That's about the same, on the same par, don't you think? I think we really heard what Waldo would have sounded like. Ralph Waldo Emerson actually was about 6 feet tall. He spoke in a booming baritone voice. He spoke with great enthusiasm and conviction. So we had a rare treat with Dick doing his interpretation of Waldo. He did go by Waldo. That's the name that he chose. He named his first son, Waldo. Ralph Waldo Emerson lived from 1803 to 1882. The time, 1803, think about the founding of our country, the time that Waldo lived was unprecedentedly dynamic and exciting. That so much was going on in our very young nation at that time. And then Boston, for example, where Waldo was born, Boston was the center, even when Waldo was born, of the intellectual aspect of our country. It was the center of course, of the Revolutionary War in many ways. And Boston continued to be this hub of so much meaningful activity. So can you imagine living from 1803 to 1882, and then particularly living in Boston? Of course, Waldo ultimately moved to Concord, which in those days was about a 1-hour horse and buggy ride. Today it's about a 15-minute car ride if the traffic is light enough. But there was so much going on at that time, and Waldo was right in the thick of it. We think of Waldo today as the father or founder of the Transcendentalist movement, which I'll talk more about a little bit later. American Romanticism, the period of open skepticism of the traditional church, led by Waldo. We think of Waldo as the father of the American literary tradition, and of course, the self-reliance movement. I Googled, early on in my research on Waldo, I Googled most famous quotes by Ralph Waldo Emerson. And one of the Google hits right away was the best 5,000 quotes from Ralph Waldo Emerson. And I don't have time for 5,000 quotes. You might want to look through those. But so many of these, I'll recite just a few of them, you will recognize quickly. And I suspect, like me, you didn't know that Ralph Waldo Emerson said a lot of these. So a few of his quotes that are so noted are, "Trust thyself. Every heart vibrates to that iron string. A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. Hitch your wagon to a star. Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist. Nothing great was ever achieved without enthusiasm." And of course, I could go on, but a few more. "To be yourself in a world that is constantly trying to make you something else is the greatest accomplishment." He said, "Do not go where the path may lead. Go instead where there is no path, and leave a trail." He said, "The earth laughs in flowers. To be great is to be misunderstood." And he knew that well. A lot of his quotes have become motivational posters. And you see these in offices and even in homes around the country, around the world, actually. He wrote, "Life is a journey, not a destination." Now, of course, Waldo didn't market these things as quotations. These were lifted later from his essays, of which he wrote thousands. He said, "Once you make a decision, the universe conspires to make it happen." People do not seem to realize that their opinion of the world is also a confession of their character. What lies behind us and what lies before us are tiny matters compared to what lies within us. To know even one life has breathed easier because you have lived. This is to have succeeded. The purpose of life is not to be happy, it is to be useful, to be honorable, to be compassionate, to have it make some difference that you have lived and lived well. Emerson was a contemporary of the who's who list of American literary figures of his time. Henry David Thoreau, Louisa May Alcott, Louisa May's father, Bronson, Margaret Fuller, and Nathaniel Hawthorne. All of those people were basically next-door neighbors of Emerson in Concord, where he lived out virtually his entire adult life. And they were actually all good friends of his. He was also a contemporary of, and knew, Walt Whitman, John Brown of the famous slave rebellion, and Abraham Lincoln. He received John Brown at his house in Concord because Emerson was a prominent figure in the American abolitionist movement before the Civil War. And Emerson visited Abraham Lincoln in the White House. He and a group of other people, other abolitionists, were pressuring Lincoln to go ahead and sign the Emancipation Proclamation and proclaim freedom of slaves. Now, Emerson's Unitarian ties. It's helpful to know, and I'm sure some of you know already, the involvement of the Unitarian Church, not UU, that came much, much later, but the Unitarian Church and the growth, the birth and the growth of the Unitarian Church in the Boston area about this time. The Unitarian Church traces its beginnings to 1773. But the UUA, the Unitarian Association, was formally founded in 1825. So all this was happening during Emerson's formative years. Emerson himself was a minister in the Unitarian Church for about 7 years. I'll talk more about that in a little bit later. He was the son of a Unitarian minister. He was the grandson of a minister who preached in the Unitarian tradition, even though it wasn't necessarily called that in his grandfather's day. The Unitarian movement, as you may know, was all about rejecting what they call the superstitious side of mainstream religion. They were a reaction to the Puritan church and to some extent the Calvinism of the era. They basically rejected the idea that religion and spirituality should be this gloom and doom, this hellfire and brimstone movement, where man is considered to have been born a sinner and must seek salvation in the Lord. They felt that man is innately good. The Unitarians preached that spirituality should be a positive, uplifting situation and not a put down and a scare tactic. They believed in hope and not fear. Sounds a little bit like some of today's rumblings, doesn't it? So Emerson did spend 7 years in the pulpit of the Unitarian Church in the Boston and Concord areas. He did graduate from the Harvard Divinity School, even though Emerson grew up very poor. His father, who was a Unitarian minister, as I said, died when Emerson was 7. So they had a house full of children. Emerson had 4 brothers and a couple of sisters who survived the early childhood years. Several didn't. And their oldest brother basically taught and supported the family. So Emerson was quite poor. He was able to get to Harvard on a variety of scholarships and through the largesse of his aunt, and he worked at the school. He later became a lifelong guest speaker at Unitarian churches, particularly in the Boston, Concord area in New England. Emerson was among even though he grew up very poor, among the Concord community where he moved while he was preaching, he was actually considered quite wealthy. He bankrolled the Transcendentalist movement. You may remember the stories of Thoreau. Thoreau living in Emerson's home in Concord, and then Thoreau erecting a shack on Walden Pond, which was on Emerson's estate. So how did Emerson get from being very poor to getting to be the bankroller of the Transcendentalist movement? Well, Emerson lucked out. Like myself, he married above his station, and he married when he was 26, and his bride, Ellen Louisa Tucker, was 18. They married, and Ellen Louisa Tucker was a beautiful woman, and she was also quite wealthy. Her family lived in Concord, which took Waldo back to Concord, even though his grandfather had also lived there and still actually owned a house there. But the first marriage of Waldo and Ellen, only lasted 2 years. She probably had tuberculosis when they married, and she died 2 years into their marriage. Waldo was very grief-stricken. It's interesting and notable that Ellen was just short of age 21 when she died. So that legal age that she had not yet attained as an adult would affect her legal right to inherit money, and thus it would affect, you would think, Waldo's ability to inherit money from his wife's estate. But on her deathbed, Ellen declared that she wished to support Waldo financially, and she wished that her inheritance go to Waldo. Waldo inherited twice. He received settlements or payouts from his wife's estate, even though his brother-in-law took him to court to try and overturn that inheritance. But Waldo inherited roughly, in today's dollars, about $600,000 after a 2-year marriage. So he was able to have a beautiful home. He built a 14-acre estate over time, and he began to be paid quite well. He gave over 1,500 paid lectures, speaking all over the U.S. and occasionally in Paris and London. He was very much in demand, and we'll talk more about his most famous essays. He also published his essays. His publications numbered more than 100. He also published some poetry. You can see a picture of Waldo's Concord home as it looks today. It is open, of course, today. Many of you may have visited Waldo's home, the Emerson home in Concord. It looks much the same as it did when it was in Emerson's possession. So, what were the formative influences on Emerson? At Harvard, he went to Harvard between the ages of 14 and 17. He entered Harvard at age 14. He graduated at age 17, actually at age 18. But you might think that meant that he was brilliant. That wasn't terribly unusual in those days. I should point out that we think of Harvard and Boston as being these major international attractions and these very large places. At the time of Emerson's, say, 10 or 12th birthday, Boston was a town of 27,000 people, and Concord was a town of 2,200. You might think of Concord about the size of Bibb City, even though it's a very different character from Bibb City in terms of its influences and its famous people who became famous at least. But Waldo was roughly in the middle of his class. Out of 50 people in his class at Harvard, Waldo was right in the middle. He was ranked about number 25. But something clicked with Waldo, roughly his sophomore or junior year of college. One of the big influences on him in college was he took a class from a young Greek professor of Greek and classical studies, and this professor taught that all religion begins in philosophy expressed mythologically. Now, you may have had some of the same experience that Waldo had. I know I certainly did. When you may have been brought up, as I was and as Waldo was, in a conservative or traditional Christian environment, and you may have been taught that the Bible is inerrant, and everything that's in the Bible is certainly reliable and divinely inspired. Waldo was. But then here's this Greek professor of Greek, who studied the Bible in Germany being very famous at that time for the critical approach to the Scriptures, the scholarly approach. And Emerson learned a lot about the Bible, and I can relate to this very well, perhaps you can, if you've taken a critical or scholarly courses in the Bible. He learned that the Bible has a lot of shortcomings. The Bible was not written by contemporaries of Jesus, particularly in the New Testament, and that a lot of the people who purport to have written books, the books are in their names, didn't write them at all. So he learned a great deal about the Bible that shocked him and that opened his eyes. Now, he did go on to become a Unitarian minister, but he was already questioning whether that was the appropriate thing for him to do for the rest of his life, and it turned out not to be. This characteristic professor brought to New England the modern history of religions view that mythology precedes theology. Okay, let's go on to his essays. First, I should say, Emerson did go on to preach, but these new awakenings, these doubts and perceptions that he learned in college, never left him, and ultimately they led to his departure from the Unitarian Church at the time. The Unitarian Church at that time, of course, was certainly a Christian church. It was not the traditional church; it was more uplifting, but it was certainly a Christian, God-believing church that generally accepted the divinity of Jesus, which Emerson rejected. Emerson's best-known essays include Self-Reliance, Nature, the Harvard Divinity School Address, which Dick read from, The Oversoul, Society and Solitude, The American Scholar, Conduct of Life, and Experience. And he wrote many, many others, but these are his best known. And I'll just say a few words about these best-known essays. He wrote Nature in 1836, 2 years prior to the famous Harvard Divinity School Address that Dick read from. Nature provides the foundation of transcendentalism. And transcendentalism, of course, is the non-traditional appreciation of nature. It is the immersion of oneself in nature and a reverence for nature. The essay suggests that the divine suffuses nature and that reality is best understood by studying nature. Emerson was greatly affected by a trip he had made a couple of years earlier to Paris, where he went to the French Natural History Museum, and he studied there the classification of plants. And he learned that everything's connected. And that had a huge impact on him. He learned to see patterns in nature and that everything depends on everything else. In this essay, he laments that humans are distracted from nature's beauty by the various demands of the world. He wrote in this essay, "To go into solitude, a man needs to retire as much from his chamber as from society. I am not solitary whilst I read and write, though nobody is with me. But if a man would be alone, let him look at the stars. When a person experiences true solitude in nature, it takes him away. Society," he says, "destroys wholeness, whereas nature, in its ministry to man, is not only the material, but is also the process and the result. All the parts incessantly work into each other's hands for the profit of man. The wind sows the seed. The sun evaporates the sea. The wind blows the vapor to the field. The ice on the other side of the planet condenses rain on this side. The rain feeds the plant. The plant feeds the animal. And thus the endless circulations of the divine charity nourish man." Emerson defines a spiritual relationship in this nature essay. He says, "In nature, a person finds its spirit and accepts it as the universal being." So I'll repeat that. I had to reread most of these parts of these essays several times to really soak in the meaning. He says, "In nature, a person finds its spirit and accepts it as the universal being." He writes, "Nature is not fixed, but fluid. Spirit alters, molds. Know then that the world exists for you. For you are the phenomenon perfect. In the woods, we return to reason and faith. There," he writes, "I feel that nothing can befall me in life. No disgrace, no calamity, which nature cannot repair. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part and particle of God." Then we come to the Harvard Divinity School Address, which Dick's already read from. And as Dick said, this address, by the way, the Harvard Divinity School, even though it had a big imposing building, it only had 7 graduating seniors. Only 6 of those actually attended the keynote address by Emerson. But the who's who of clergy did attend that session. Certainly the leadership of the Unitarian Church did. And by 1838, the Harvard Divinity School was basically an arm of the Unitarian Church. But in this speech, even though it's done in a language that can be difficult for us today to understand, Emerson discounted the biblical miracles. He proclaimed that Jesus was not God. And the speech led to a fallout between Harvard and Emerson. He was labeled in Boston and the environs an atheist, and he was vilified. Mothers would supposedly, I read accounts that mothers would take their children when they see Emerson coming down the street of Boston or Concord and cross the street to avoid close contact with this wild man. But Emerson said in this Harvard Divinity School address that historical Christianity had turned Jesus into a demigod, as the Orientals or the Greeks would describe Osiris or Apollo. He said that Christianity, quote, dwells with noxious exaggeration about the person of Jesus. Although Emerson's Harvard banishment lasted for another 30 years, he was later a point of pride for Harvard. Harvard took him back in, you might say. They named Emerson Hall after him in 1900. And then 168 years after the famous address, in May 2006, the Harvard Divinity School announced the establishment of the Emerson Unitarian Universalist Association Professorship. I believe Connie and I heard a person who went to the Harvard Divinity School and studied the Unitarian Universalism there, speaking up in I believe it was Franklin, North Carolina. Emerson moved away from his early emphasis on mystical experience and increasingly came to emphasize right action as the fundamental core of religion, the notion that pure religion equals pure morality. Emerson expressed his belief in religion as action in the world when he wrote in his journal, "I like not the man who is thinking how to be good, but the man thinking how to accomplish his work." In the Divinity School address, Emerson is saying, "I want you to be everything you can be, to know all the beauty of who you are." But he says this in a very loving way. He gave advice that you as a minister need to be a cheerleader, a coach. Of course, he didn't use words quite that plain and not quite that modern. He said, "Whenever the invitation of men or your own occasions lead you, wherever they lead you, speak the very truth, as your life and conscience teach it, and cheer the waiting, fainting hearts of men with new hope and new revelation." He said, "A more secret, sweet, and overpowering beauty appears to man when his heart and mind open to the sentiment of virtue." Here he means that when man opens his heart in this way, he sees his place in the world and understands that he has an enormous capacity for goodness. Emerson ends this speech by saying that he is looking forward to the time when men shall see the world to be the mirror of the soul, which leads us to the famous essay, The Oversoul. The Oversoul, I think I first read maybe about a freshman in high school when I first read it. And to me, that was the religion I was looking for. That was the idea that instead of a creator who creates people, who creates everything, that instead we are all tied together through an oversoul. And that the soul, Emerson would object to the idea that we possess a soul. He says we don't possess it at all. But the soul that we are perhaps the custodian of is a better word, is borrowed temporarily from the great oversoul to which it returns, without memory of us, of our physical identification, when it goes back to the oversoul. In this essay, Emerson continued his personal opposition to a personal and historical God. He saw the oversoul, a term that he sometimes substituted for the word God, as a unifying force or energy, a structure in all things. He did not believe in personal immortality. The soul, he said, does not know persons, but the soul is inextricably linked to all other souls, past, present, and future. The essay includes this passage: "The supreme critic on the errors of the past and the present, and the only prophet of that which must be, is that great nature in which we rest, as the earth lies in the soft arms of the atmosphere, that unity, that oversoul, within which every man's particular being is contained and made one with all other, that common heart. For Emerson, this term denotes a supreme underlying unity which transcends duality or plurality. Emerson goes on in the same essay to further articulate his views of the dichotomy between phenomenal plurality and transcendental unity. He says, "We live in succession, in division, in parts, in particles. Meantime, within man is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty, to which every part and particle is equally related, the eternal one. And this deep power in which we exist and whose beatitude is all accessible to us is not only self-sufficing and perfect in every hour, but the act of seeing and the thing seen, the seer and the spectacle, the subject and the object are one. We see the world piece by piece, as the sun, the moon, the animal, the tree, but the whole, of which these are shining parts, is the soul." Now let's look at Emerson's legacy of what he's left us today, how he's relevant to us today. Much of the humanist side of today's UU Church practices what Waldo taught. In Waldo's rebellion against the Unitarian Church, he was actually laying the foundations for UU, and he believes much of what UU teaches today. His ideas permeate modern culture and ideas. One popular song of my generation comes to mind from Pink Floyd, where the lyrics include, "We don't need no education," and "teachers leave them kids alone." That really mirrors Emerson. Even though he was very well educated and extremely well read, his philosophy as an adult about education was read and interpret for yourself. Don't accept others' interpretations. Another part of his legacy is our national park system, and its mission are heavily influenced by Emerson. Others who cited his great influence on their lives include John Muir, Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, Friedrich Nietzsche, Henry David Thoreau, and Walt Whitman. We owe a tremendous debt to this great man. Thank you.
As we prepare to leave, take a look again at our chalice, remembering that it represents reason, tolerance, and freedom mixed with respect, compassion, and love. As I extinguish the chalice here, keep this flame glowing in your heart and let it light your path as you go through the week. And this from the book of James, chapter 1. Be doers of the word and not merely hearers, those who look into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and persevere, being not hearers who forget, but doers who act. They will be blessed in their doing. Would everyone please rise up off your couch or chair in body or spirit for the closing words? And please say them with me. With unity of spirit, we go our ways in universal fellowship until we meet again. Go in love.